This video was sponsored by NordVPN. In 2019, Foxconn founder Terry Gou called on Apple to move its manufacturing out of China. That same year, Terry Gou actually went for presidency in Taiwan, so many speculated that this statement was just yet another political campaign slogan rather than a serious suggestion. After all, Apple directly and indirectly employed about 1.5 million people in the country. They had literal cities erected and staffed on their behalf by the Chinese government, and they counted China as their second largest market after only the United States. Apple has invested almost $300 billion in the country and is the foreign tech giant with the largest exposure to the Middle Kingdom by far, on both the production and on the consumption side. If anyone would resist leaving the country behind, it would have to be them. And yet, over the next few years, the revenue shares of Chinese companies in Apple's supply chain quietly went from 61% to 53% and then 47% last year. Of the new suppliers that the company added, 79% were from outside of China, and the company quietly set up at least one manufacturing site outside of China for every one of its major products. From iPhones to iPads and MacBooks to AirPods, every single one. Apple is still very much married to China. Just last year, it was estimated to have produced about 90% of its products in the country. Even when going abroad, it sometimes just uses Chinese contract manufacturers like Luxshare, who just build factories outside of the country for them. And just last week, Tim Cook was the most prominent guest at China's annual event parading foreign companies that declare their love for the country. It is clear that the company can't make their pivot too obvious or too drastic without also losing their gigantic Chinese consumer base. But even they have started to make their first clear steps outside of the country, while other companies that are not as closely tied to China have made much bigger jumps already, and this gradual loss of manufacturing is actually only the first of 4 major threats that the Chinese tech sector has to fight off to survive. Analysts have long been predicting the eventual decline of Chinese manufacturing. After all, labor costs in the country have risen dramatically long ago. The country reached the so-called Lewis turning point around 2011, meaning that it ran out of the seemingly endless rural population whose move to the cities fueled their manufacturing boom, and the share of people aged 20 to 30, the demographic which is the most suited for long shifts in factories, is already in especially short supply due to low birth rates as well. And yet the country has shrugged these ticking time bombs off one by one in the past and has actually seen their share of the world's manufacturing output rise from 20% to 30% not long ago, instead of the fall that everyone seems to have expected. But while demographic and cost concerns have not on their own created the mass exodus from the country, adding political pressure on top seems to have finally tipped the scales. South Korean firms lost much of their business in the country in the 2010s due to political clashes and mismanagement, and so they had little to lose and were therefore the first to leave. From Samsung to LG to Hyundai, these giants have already moved the majority of their manufacturing outside of China. Firms from other countries were slower, but are now making similar decisions as well. Dell reportedly plans to move 50% of its manufacturing outside of the country by 2025, HP has committed to moving 30%, Apple to at least 25%, and others like Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Sony, Nintendo, etc. have all been reported to do the same too. Even Chinese firms are increasingly moving their manufacturing abroad to bow to political pressure, like how almost 100% of the phones and TVs sold in India are now at least assembled there due to government mandates and tax policies, which made the Chinese company Oppo the largest phone manufacturer in the whole country. Most companies are unwilling to make big public statements as they fear retaliation, but survey after survey shows that most technology companies are looking to diversify from China, and big industrial suppliers like Japan's Kyocera have openly claimed that China can no longer be the factory of the world. Chinese factories will still likely produce most products for their domestic market, and in some industries, like electric vehicles, we might even see China's share rise as the country has a close grip on key battery materials and has just last year made it possible for foreign companies like Tesla Tesla to operate without having to form a joint venture with a local partner. But overall, from COVID-related disruptions to fears of trade wars to an increasing demand to re-onshore manufacturing by countries all over the world, the pressure is clear and the outflow of manufacturing from China is only going to get more prominent in the future. Now, while a loss in manufacturing is really painful, especially when it happens on the low end, this is a technically solvable problem. In fact, almost all of China's now wealthy neighbors, from Japan to Korea to Taiwan to Singapore, have all seen their low-end manufacturing sectors lost, but when that happened to them, they transitioned to higher value-added sectors like cars and semiconductors, so they did just fine. And China was clearly on the same path until recently as well, developing their own national champions from Huawei to DJI, BYD to TikTok and more, and the government had explicit plans to take things even further. In 2015, the communist leadership revealed the Made in China 2025 plan, which declared that China wanted to become the market leader in AI, 5G, aerospace, semiconductors, electric vehicles, and biotech by 2025, both domestically and internationally as well, and that the government would do just about everything in its power to achieve this. From generous tax breaks to hundreds of billions of dollars in direct state funding, the country explicitly told its industry that it would give them money for R&D, foreign acquisitions, and of course allegedly the theft of trade secrets too, all in the name of winning these sectors. From the perspective of China, this was them primarily trying to break free of their decades of reliance on critical inputs from unreliable foreign entities, like the hundreds of billions of dollars of semiconductors that they had to import every single year. But from the West and China's other rivals like India, this actually sounded a whole lot like a lethal threat. After Deng Xiaoping's rise in the late 1980s, China's official foreign policy was famously described as hide your strength, bide your time, meaning that they explicitly avoided confrontation. But Made in China 2025 was the end of that policy. It was an existential challenge communicated in the open, and it came from a new leadership that clearly saw China's rise as inevitable and the rest of the world as slow and incapable of even forming a united front, let alone putting up a real fight. But as it turns out, China was wrong. While the reaction did indeed take multiple years to form, as countries were slow to create legal frameworks and whatnot, it was extremely strong and much more united than anyone would have thought. And this created the next two massive problems for China's tech industry, starting with a loss of high-tech imports. China's adversaries quickly realized that the country was still extremely reliant on foreign inputs, especially around semiconductors, which they could starve them off. This initially started off by just the United States, targeting just ZTE and Huawei with chip and software bans, but with time, just about every other country with advanced chip-making capabilities joined these sanctions as well. The list of targeted companies came to include essentially every major Chinese firm that was critical to semiconductors, artificial intelligence, military tech, and more, and the bans are increasingly also covering the whole semiconductor supply chain too. From finished chips to all fabrication tools and processes, to even human capital, where US employees are completely barred from working for select Chinese companies, and also money, as critical companies and industries were made off-limits to foreign investors. And unsurprisingly, international money, talent, and other inputs flowing into Chinese tech companies have been reduced significantly as a result. There are still some fairly obvious loopholes in these bans, allowing sanctioned Chinese companies to, for example, set up shell companies to make purchases on their behalves, but these loopholes are getting closed down one by one, and the intention of lawmakers is overwhelmingly to move towards more restrictions. China's massive attempt to buy whole, critically important companies from abroad was also cut short, and governments from the US to Germany, Italy, Britain, and more all started blocking critical acquisitions. Now, China is still far from complete semiconductor isolation, but just to demonstrate how extremely devastating such a ban would be, let's take a look at a concrete example of innovation, for example, the development of a new AI tool, and let's see how a ban would impact it. To develop the revolutionary GPT-4, for example, the tool's creator, OpenAI, needed the world's best software developers. Those developers then needed access to around 10,000 of the world's most advanced chips from NVIDIA to run training and inferencing workloads on. NVIDIA needed the world's most advanced semiconductor factory, TSMC, who then needed the world's most advanced chip-making machines from the likes of ASML, Applied Materials, Tokyo Electron, and more, who then needed the world's most advanced lasers from Kymer and Trumpf, and the most advanced mirrors from Zeiss, photomasks from Toppan and Dai Nippon Printing, and the list goes on. Every single product in this chain combined is what resulted in the quality of the final innovation. And all of them were made by global market leaders with no or close to no comparable substitutes anywhere in the world, including in China. Catching up with either of them would be a massive achievement on its own, but in the case of full isolation, they would need to match every single one of them simultaneously while also being under sanctions. That is so difficult that it is basically not possible. And while this is a hypothetical scenario, you can see that the closer we get to full isolation, the harder it becomes for Chinese companies to innovate. Now, the third problem of China's tech industry is its loss of international markets. As the country's leading technology companies developed, they naturally exhausted their domestic markets and started expanding abroad. But even these attempts are increasingly starting to get blocked. Huawei's and ZTE's equipment was banned from not just the US, but all Five Eyes countries as well as Japan, while other more hesitant Western governments are increasingly looking to ban them too, and their phones are made largely redundant outside of China through various bans as well. India banned basically all major Chinese internet service providers from the country, causing internet giants like Alibaba, TikTok, and Tencent to exit the country after having spent billions building up their positions there. TikTok is banned from the phones of politicians in the US, Australia, and the European Parliament, and the US government is on track to roll out the most devastating new legislation yet, the Restrict Act. This will create a new and clear legal framework allowing the country's Commerce Department to decide which foreign firms constitute national threats, which can then be banned as the department sees fit. TikTok is clearly meant to be the first target of this framework, but it is specifically designed to be an easy tool for banning more Chinese companies in the future too. China still has massive opportunities to expand abroad, especially in developing countries and especially with infrastructure projects, but those opportunities are hardly replacements for the lost chance at selling advanced technologies to rich consumer markets. Like with the other two issues, these export restrictions initially started small but are increasingly getting bigger and bigger with time, and they mean that Chinese high-tech companies can increasingly only rely on their domestic market to grow. And talking about domestic growth, we get to problem number 4, China's domestic chaos. I've already made a whole dedicated video about the Chinese government's vicious crackdown on its own tech giants, which you can watch here for more details, but in short, the government reacted to an increasingly unruly and powerful private technology industry by pushing through a set of serious reforms in which it completely reorganized ownership structures, jailed and fined hundreds of entities, etc. Alibaba, the poster child of these crackdowns, has just been forced to split up into 6 separate companies, for example, and its founder, Jack Ma, has just been, let's just say, politely convinced that after a year of spending time abroad, it was time that he should finally return to the embrace of his motherland. Together with the massive state-directed push of industrial policies like Made in China 2025, it is clear that the government switched gears from supporting liberalization to more and more state control. Innovation should be driven less by private companies chasing profits and more by the government setting priorities and ordering its firms to achieve them. Central planning like this can arguably be useful sometimes, and it can also achieve major results, but it of course also introduces a whole lot of inefficiencies, corruption, etc. So putting those together then, the Chinese technology sector is bleeding manufacturing jobs to their neighbors on the low end, it is increasingly cut off from the imports that it needs to advance on the high end, it has lost its most lucrative export markets that it could expand to with its high-tech products, and it has to deal with a whole lot more political oversight and central planning at home. Neither of these challenges are impossible to beat on their own, and Chinese tech companies have proven to be incredibly resilient in the past. but that's one hell of a set of challenges to overcome. Seeing all of these mounting pressures, we can clearly see that China's leadership has started reacting too, and it has started scaling back its own crackdowns on its domestic tech giants and started promising them that things will be more calm going forward, while they've also made major concessions and gestures to international businesses too. From the country's commerce minister literally holding a conference to declare that foreign companies in China are family, to letting foreign firms operate much more freely in previously protected industries like cars and financial services, such as wealth management, to even reportedly considering letting some of those firms list on Chinese exchanges to gather investments from Chinese citizens, the country's leadership is clearly reaching out with some major olive branches to cool some tensions both internationally and at home. Whether those will work, we'll have to wait and see. Every day, the world feels less and less globalized, and even on the internet, where information should theoretically flow across country borders unrestricted, we keep bouncing into issues now. And to break some of these boundaries down at least, most of us need a VPN, and the best option for that is Nord. Why? Because it is exceptionally fast, exceptionally safe, and because I have an exceptionally good deal for you. To be exact, Nord is the fastest VPN service from all the major options according to independent speed tests. It is so fast that I literally forget about it even being on in most cases, regardless of which of their 60 countries I choose. Meanwhile, their strict no-logs policy and other advanced safety features are now not just backed up by pretty promises, but lately even the fact that they have just open-sourced much of their code, including their whole Linux client app and their various networking and file-sharing libraries, etc., so you can poke around their code and go nuts on GitHub if you'd like. I'm not a developer, so I'm just gonna flip a switch and watch some TV shows that are somehow not available here in Germany, but either way, I said that I'd have a deal for you, and here it is. A Nord account covers 6 different devices, including even your router if you want it, so you can cover a whole family with it. And if you use my link, nordvpn.com/techaltar, which you can also find in the description below, you will actually get 4 months for free with a 2-year plan. That is pretty good. 4 months for free, and there's also a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there is basically no risk in giving them a try. So check that out, links are in the description, and I'll see you in the next video.